Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. Next week, from June 24th to 25th, NATO will hold its annual summit this year in The Hague. Allies are intentionally setting expectations low. The ultimate goal, it seems, is to navigate the summit without major incident and get through it with the alliance unity still intact. The major headline for the summit will be a historic new pledge to spend 5% of GDP on defense, including 3.5% on core defense capabilities and 1.5% on investments in supporting areas such as resilience and infrastructure. Allies have also designated certain capabilities for each member to acquire to fulfill the alliance's updated defense plans. But everything is not in agreement going into the summit. In particular, NATO members continue to debate what Ukraine's participation in the summit should look like. The lack of allied consensus on Russia is also striking, as demonstrated by the suspension of an ongoing Russia strategy review that was originally due to be presented at the summit, but canned because of allies' fears that they would not be able to reach consensus given the Trump administration's views on Russia. And of course, there remain concerns about what may happen after the summit, with allies anxiously awaiting the outcome of the U.S. posture review, which could see the United States downsize its military presence in Europe. So to discuss expectations and potential outcomes for the NATO summit, we're really pleased to welcome Julianne Smith and Camille to the podcast. Julie, Camille, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very brief intros. Julie is the president of Clarion Strategies and the former U.S. permanent representative to NATO. And Camille is a distinguished policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations and the former assistant secretary general for defense investment at NATO. Okay, let's do a quick scene setter. I did my intro, but what are you both looking at? What would be your scene setter ahead of the summit next week? Julie, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Well, it is going to be a very narrowly focused summit. As you mentioned, the allies are going to be focused on rolling out this big new announcement on defense spending. And this is good news. This is something that we should celebrate. But as you noted, there are some missing pieces. It is not at all clear that the allies will talk about or comment on the ongoing war in Ukraine. They certainly will not be rolling out a new strategy on Russia. We also don't know whether or not the IP4 leaders will be included. I understand that they're coming, but I don't see a role for them. So I don't think NATO will be advancing its relationship with the Indo-Pacific leaders. And lastly, I'll say what's really not on the table is for kind of a plan for Europe to get at the fragmentation that exists across the continent. My worry is that this increase in resourcing or resources will actually end up just being poured into the existing silos so that Europe won't build the capacity it needs at the scale that is required in this moment, both to fill their acute needs in Europe and to keep helping Ukraine.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I think we've repeated, like, just doing a little more of everything they're already doing isn't going to do it. But Camille, anything you would add?
No, I guess the summit is built around the endorsement of this 5% pledge, 3.5 on core defense and 1.5, which is supposed to create a good news story of a united alliance that is doing more and stepping up. Hopefully that will go well, and there will be a sort of unanimous endorsement of this objective. Of course, we'll go back to the nitty-gritty of it, which is, of course, a little more complicated than the statement. What is interesting and probably that we'll have to follow very carefully is how does the rest go? The issue, how do we handle Ukraine and Russia in this particular context? What are the news with regard to the U.S. force posture in Europe? The administration has announced that there would be cuts in the U.S. Footprint in Europe, and quite clearly the administration has not shared that with allies yet. They say that it's still in the making, but that's going to come after the summit. But of course, that's going to loom a bit over the summit.
Well, let's get into the nitty gritty really quick of the 5% target, because I think that is obviously the kind of banner headline. It's a creative way to get at the 5% that Donald Trump has been banging on about. Um, is it How wise is the choice to kind of do that? So first of all, how much of a fudge is it? Is it a way for allies just to stick a whole bunch of stuff in there that maybe we really shouldn't be counting, just so that we can all say that we've met what President Trump has been asking for? And then the second part of that too, though, is it a good idea? Do you think that there's a risk that if allies don't get to that 5% target in a reasonable manner, that it becomes a cudgel that Trump uses to target and harass allies and maybe threaten not to defend them, for example, if they're not committing the pledge? So I want just views from both of you. I mean, I guess I do fundamentally agree, Julie, that it is good news. But are there risks in there, things that you worry about, and like how much wisdom is there in this approach to getting to this 5%?
Yeah, I mean, it does carry risks. There are a number of risks. So first of all, let's back up and review history. So it was in 2014, of course, that allies decided that they all needed to commit to fulfill the 2% pledge within 10 years. And as of last year, we had just 2/3 of the alliance at 2%. That's amazing in terms of the leap we've seen many countries in the alliance take in terms of increasing their defense spending, but it left 1/3 of the alliance below 2%. So now that you add this very ambitious target on top of the drive to get to 2%, the question is how many allies believe they can get to 3.5% within a very short time frame? The Trump administration is signaling that they're quite impatient. They want to see progress immediately. And leaping from, say, 1.5 to 3.5, I mean, you can't really overestimate here how hard that is going to be. And for some nations, in fact, my prediction is they will not get there for maybe upwards of a decade plus. It could be much longer, depending on the country you're talking about. And then in terms of the construct that they've built, I mean, I'm all for allies spending more on cyber and infrastructure. My fear with this division is that a lot of allies will be quick to claim they've met the 1.5 by putting everything they have and more into the 1.5. I mean, the alliance is always trying to bat away suggestions that we should put half of our federal budgets into defense spending in the name of resilience. You don't want to have a situation where allies are suddenly putting hospitals, into their resilience 1.5. So first of all, it will be a battle to determine what goes in the 1.5. And secondly, you're going to have a number of allies say, well, look, we met the 1.5. Sorry, we're way behind the curve on the 3.5. Last thing I'll say is what's bothering me right now is sometimes I hear from some allies in Europe, this 3.5 number seems very arbitrary to us. It just kind of came out of nowhere. And actually, there I would beg to differ because 2 years ago, the alliance rolled out a set of regional plans, as we all know. And if you ask General Cavoli, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, any time in the last 2 years, hey, General Cavoli, where do you think allies would have to be to fulfill the regional plans and implement them effectively? He was frequently giving allies a rough estimate between 3.5 and 3.7. So the plans were put in place in the Biden administration well before Donald Trump arrived again on the scene. And so I would hate for some allies to say, this just came out of thin air. I think the 5% might have, and that's up for debate. Curious what others think here on the podcast. But I think the 3.5 to me really resonates because of those new regional plans.
I agree with Julie. I think there is, first of all, the 3.5 is not arbitrary, and the use of a percentage of GDP is the best measure we found to try to capture what's happening. It's fair to those who have smaller economies. It sort of gives us a direction of travel to everyone. It helps focus the mind, just as the 2% agreed in the Wales Summit played that role. So it's not absurd. And by the way, it's more or less the Cold War average. It's close to the US current number. So it sort of makes sense for all allies to sort of align themselves with this. I think there is an interesting point, which is to say, okay, it's this whole effort is partially built to give credit to President Trump for getting to 5% and blah, blah, blah. I guess it's also very much a Putin thing, and many allies get it and want to move there. Regarding I think the devil is going to be in the details indeed. Are there milestones on the way to 3.5? Is there is the date to achieve that objective close enough that the effort will be deliberate and immediate, or will it be a bit over the horizon with at least some allies thinking, well, in 10 years from now, we'll see where we are, and there will no longer be a war in Ukraine, and Donald Trump will be gone, and we can go back to being lazy about defense spending. So I think that's going to be very interesting to watch precisely in the communique. How is it phrased? People have forgotten now, but the Wales communique was itself had some caveats built in, depending on the economic situation, and try to, and it was not only about cash but also about contributions and things like that. So I think that we're going to see a bit of that, and that's probably what's happening right now in the headquarters at NATO of allies trying to insert things that will eventually get them off the hook partially. There, the Trump administration plays a useful role by, being on their back and making clear that they would not settle for something too weak in terms of the strength of the commitment. The 1.5 is indeed, and Julie rightly pointed this out. I mean, there are a lot of things can qualify as useful for security and defense. Some of them are incredibly useful if we enhance military mobility, if we make sure that our cyber resilience is enhanced. All of these things make a lot of sense, and it's good to help allies focus on that, even if some of that is already ongoing, and it's a sort of easy way to reach 5% by adding stuff that were happening already. But it's going to be very important to have relatively strict criteria, not so that any road is not eligible, or any railway mile is not eligible. That it has to respond to actual military and NATO requirements. So that's going to be another one to watch. Then, when it comes to the allies, and I think it's important to put this into perspective, I think the reality is we have, I would argue, about four different groups. There are those who are already above 3.5 that outspend the US. The Poles, the Baltic states are there, essentially. So for them, it's a bit of a no-brainer. In fact, they could even reduce their defense spending to meet the new Hague criteria. Then you have a group that is getting there, and that is very active to get there, that has the fiscal room for maneuver, that is very deliberate, that has a good understanding of the threat, and that is very focused. There I would put the Nordics, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. To a certain extent, Germany and the Netherlands, which are moving fast and have really made clear that they wanted to go there. Then there is a third group of countries which sign up, I think, genuinely to the commitment, but face very severe fiscal constraints. In that group, I would put the UK, France, Greece is another example, and a number of other countries that are, I think, committed in principle and agree that it's the right target, but will face headwinds to get there at pace. And some of these matter, substantially. And then there is a third group, which is currently those who are not even at 2%, and as Julie was mentioning, are sort of struggling to get there and are suddenly saying, "Whoa, my God, we now need to double down to reach 3.5." And there you would find Spain, Italy, maybe Canada, Belgium, a number of countries that are essentially saying, for a mix of domestic political reason, a different threat perception, that okay, if we have to sign up to this to get a good summit, we will do. But can we put, insert a few sentences that will be reviewed? That can we push the date as far as possible? Can we avoid too close of a monitoring on the on progress and all of that? So that's exactly those four camps, if I may put it this way, that are in the room. I would nevertheless argue that there is a broad understanding, and Mark Rutte has done a good job from that perspective, of okay, this is what we need to do, and we need to be there somehow, and let's work out the details, but let's move at pace. So that's where we are. But I think it's almost a done deal. But as NATO wonks, we will of course look into the details and how it is applied, and it will probably require a lot of work by the NATO headquarters and the international staff to sort of look over the shoulder of allies to make sure that both the 3.5 and the 1.5 are well spent and that progress is achieved.
Well, it's great to see both of you. Thank you so much for coming. Julie, when I see you, I think of the early days of Brussels sprouts, and we were sitting next to each other behind these microphones, and how far we've come. I'm not sure what our leadership, our readership, or listenership is now, but probably a little bit better than we were back on those early days, but maybe not. So anyway, it's great to see you.
Much stronger. I'm convinced of it.
Camille, when I last saw you, we was in a nice bistro in Paris. So let's see if we can do that again. That was a great conversation that we had. So, one thing I've been getting already calls from the press. They're beginning to do these stories on the summit. And one thing I've emphasized to them, and it's exactly what you guys have been saying. I agree completely with what you're saying. But a lot of times when they open up the conversation, they'll say, "So this is really a nothing summit." And I said, "No, absolutely, it is something here." And I said, you have to look on it this way. This summit at the Hague, actually, the strands are coming together to make the alliance much stronger in terms of our deterrent and in terms of messaging the Russians that we're serious about this. And I said, let me explain why. We talked about the 3.5, et cetera, but I said, what you don't know is that the defense ministers a few weeks ago approved capability goals. So that's the shopping list for these countries to purchase to fulfill their part of these plans. I said, at The Hague, this is going to come together where the heads of state and government are going to approve these capability goals, the shopping list, all of them are going to have, and the countries are going to agree on the money to pay for it. And I said, and this is what's going to go into these plans to make them real. This is what Russia is going to have to understand, that it's not just a lot of talk at NATO, that we're putting money towards buying those things to put these plans into place. So I said, this is actually a very important summit. This is not something just to poo-poo. This is where we're really showing a very different NATO than I saw back when I was there, when it was a lot of smoke and mirrors. I said, this is real stuff. Now, of course, as we've just spoken, there's caveats, and but as I'm trying to have the press look at this, is look on it in terms of what the alliance is doing, in terms of a very serious deterrent towards the Russians, and the muscle behind it. If everybody does what they're supposed to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how I'm trying to frame it for them. But I am worried about how press conferences are going to go when we have to talk about Russia and Ukraine particularly. And I know they're trying to keep Ukraine kind of to a small part of the agenda, not enough, not a lot of paragraphs talking about a bridge to NATO and this type of thing, but they're going to try to keep it much less visible and much less of a target. But I'm not sure how long that's going to last when the press starts asking questions, and I'm not sure how they're going to explain why there's not a Russia strategy. And the press knows about that. I've been getting calls about the Russia strategy. Why isn't there one? Has it been postponed? Is this trouble in the alliance? So I do think we're going to have a some trouble there, not just with Ukraine and Russia, but making sure that's not interpreted as big unity problems at NATO, and which are there, and they know about that too. But it's going to be a big job, I think, for the section to try to stitch it all together and really keep the theme on NATO demonstrating its strength instead of being having a culture war debates within the NAC. So I'll just throw that on the table. See what you think on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it is a major achievement for the alliance to roll out the 5% announcement, but I think you can't look at it in a vacuum. You cannot assume that allies will maintain a multi-year commitment to this 5% target without a strategy on what we're doing on Ukraine and Russia. I mean, at some point, a finance minister and the publics in these countries and the politicians are going to say, wait a minute, why are we spending all of this money? And oh, by the way, it appears to us like the US is getting prepared to take force posture out of Eastern Europe. That seems to signal to us that the US assessment is that the Russian threat has diminished. And therefore, we can not only consider withdrawing our own troops, although I hope they reach a different conclusion and backfill the US troops that are departing, but a politician or a leader of a country could say, not only should we consider possibly reducing our force presence in Eastern Europe, we can slow roll these defense increases. I mean, we went in the alliance for the last 4 years from 9 allies spending 2% in 2021 to 23 in 2024. So 9 to 23 is a significant jump. What made that happen? I would argue continued pressure from the United States, but most importantly, President Putin and the war he started in Ukraine that really focused minds. It brought the alliance together. It was our organizing principle. It was our chief project. And it made all of our differences wash away because we were focused on the war in Ukraine. Now, with an open ended question about whether or not the US will continue supporting Ukraine and whether or not the US is more closely aligned with Russia's position in the war more broadly, I really wonder how the political debates or the lack of commentary about Ukraine and Russia will bleed over into this wonderful, historic announcement that's about to happen on June 24 and 25th.
Yeah, I
Right,
agree.
right to me, right before you jump in and answer, Julie, can you just give a little background on the Russia strategy and why it was when it was introduced,
Sure.
this idea, why it was introduced, what the vision behind doing this was? I think it's important that people understand that context, and then to think about what it means that it was suspended and the signal that it sends.
So, yes, absolutely. So, your listeners know because they're good NATO nerds that the Alliance rewrites its strategic concept kind of roughly once a decade. And so, the last time that the Alliance has done this was in 2022. And at the time, the wording on Russia in prior strategic concepts was focused largely on deterrence and dialogue and engagement. And what the alliance did is it reduced mention of dialogue engagement for all the obvious reasons, because Russia was starting a war in Ukraine. And while it focused on deterrence, it put in some very strongly worded language, essentially saying Russia is a direct threat to the NATO alliance. And it couldn't have been more clear in the language that allies used. And so that got us through 2022. But as we moved into 2023, several allies said, well, it's interesting. We changed the language in the strategic concept. And now there are a lot of questions that flow from that. For example, what should we do about the NATO Russia Founding Act that was signed and agreed to in the late 1990s? Should we kind of put that through the shredder? What do we do with the NATO Russia Council that last met in January of 2022? And for quite some time, the Allies were pushing away from having that debate because they were worried how divisive it would be. It would just basically crack open the alliance. But at a certain point, I think all allies understood that, okay, this is a debate we have to have. So the best way to go about that was to agree last year in the Washington summit, hey, the alliance needs a proper Russia strategy. The language in the strategic concept is great, but it's just a couple sentences. Let's flesh this out. Let's talk about hybrid warfare, gray zone tactics. We'll talk about the NATO Russia Founding Act. And that was the plan, so that by this June, we'd be rolling out this new Russia strategy. But given where the Trump administration is at the moment, and the uncertainty about kind of whether or not they're more closely aligned with Russia when it comes to the war in Ukraine, I think the allies rightly decided maybe this isn't the time to take all of this on, especially while we have a negotiation that was being pursued at least a couple months ago quite actively by the Trump administration. So long story short, they kicked the can, but these questions are not going away and they're going to be back. And my prediction is they'll be back right after the summer break when allies reconvene in September, and they'll be right back at it, having the exact same debates.
So Camille, over to you. I mean, so how is Europe then interpreting this crazy dance that Julie identified? Like spend more, but Russia's not a threat. I mean, you even had Whitaker saying, I think, that it's preposterous to think that Russia would be marching across Europe, kind of putting forward these like straw man maximalist arguments to claim that Russia is a lesser threat than the alliance is making it out to be. So how is that contradiction being internalized in Europe?
In all fairness, we should first recognize that mm, Russia, the perception of Russia as a threat, there are a bit 50 shades of gray in the alliance. I mean, there are those who are quite Russia friendly, Hungary, to those who for whom it seems a bit far away, the further south, and geography matters. It's quite normal that you have a slightly different perception whether you're in Estonia or in Spain. Fair enough. Uh, there was, however, a big effort because of the war in Ukraine to bring everyone closer, and the Biden administration played an important role in that particular effort. But there was a much closer alignment over this issue in the last 4 years. So it is indeed a bit problematic to see a situation where we could well be have a sign of division over what is the most important threat facing the alliance. Having said this, I think the issue is indeed a bit of post-summit issue. I think there is an effort to sort of muddle through the summit by saying, okay, we have this unified message on defense spending, on capability targets, on we are a healthy, strong alliance, and everything's going to be okay. We have a new burden sharing. But what is not clear, indeed, is where are we heading as an alliance post-summit in a way? Because at the moment, I guess most Europeans just want the summit not to go away, but to be a success, to sort of tick the box of saying we had a unified summit. Uh, there was no drama. There was no big event. It was a bit uneventful, and we announced good news of on the alliance, on defense spending, on burden sharing that everyone can take home, and hopefully with no big drama. We might come back to that on the spoilers in that context. But the reality is that there are open issues, and the biggest open issue, which is core business for the alliance, is indeed how do we handle Ukraine and Russia, and there is a clear division that has emerged between the U.S. and its allies on the handling of the peace talks around Ukraine, and an effort to a bit diminish the nature of the Russian threat, which is a bit disconcerting, not for all allies, but for a number of them. So that creates an issue. So I guess post-summit, we have a bit two direction of travel. One is that of an alliance that does change quite profoundly, that is more European, where the Europeans, as Secretary Exet has been saying, are more responsible for the conventional defense of Europe. And we understand that America has other priorities, that the good old days of hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in Europe is probably gone forever, but and that there will be a bit of a shrinking presence, but the alliance endures, and we stay reasonably aligned on the major crisis and the major threats facing Europe. That is a sort of optimistic scenario that most European allies are working to achieve to do this, and I'm sure there are folks in the administration that want to achieve that as well, as many leaders in Washington, in Congress, and elsewhere. But there is also another scenario in which, in fact, what we're seeing is the first step towards a very significant decisions to downsize the US presence in Europe, with risks associated with that, especially if the tactic that is chosen is to make bold unilateral moves rather than very concerted moves. And that is not out of off the table as we speak, I'm afraid, combined with a drift over Russia and Ukraine, that becomes not only a sort of tactical debate on the handling of Russia, and should we be ready to resume some sort of a discussion with the Russians if they agree to an acceptable peace in Ukraine, which is the sort of typical debate that we've had for many years on resets with Russia and so on. Not so successful, but let's recognize that every single administration has tried a form of a reset with the Russians somehow, and the European allies have been either supportive or hesitant to go on this. But here it would be more fundamental, and there we would be facing quite a different future, with the US far less committed to European security, far less engaged into NATO, and more importantly, from my perspective, even a situation where there is a fundamental disagreement over what Russia represents to the alliance, and is it really a threat? And there, for the time being, it's a bit about ironing that difference. Fair enough. But it will come back with a vengeance right after the summit, in a way, and we can't completely escape that conversation, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I've kind of been thinking or talking about the summit as the calm before the storm, where we're kind of all like holding our breath and hopefully we get through it and it's not too bad, but there could be much stormier weather ahead. But to the point of the summit, Julie, how do you hope that our European allies try to iron over, I guess, what Camille just said? And I guess maybe to make it more specific, for example, I'm hearing that the communique may be boiled down and smushed down to like 4 to 6 paragraphs, just because there won't be enough language to agree on. So there's going to be all sorts of things that go unsaid: language on Ukraine, language on the Russia threat. So how do you hope allies navigate that? I mean, do they just kind of go along and tiptoe along, or do we need them to say the things that the Trump administration won't say? Like, is it almost like there's two summits, and the European allies really need to show much more unity and leadership on some of these issues, even if there's a risk that it kind of alienates the US? I don't know what the right answer is, but I just kind of throw it out there because there's just so much that I think will be unspoken.
Well, I don't think anybody wants the summit to come crashing down because there's some sort of clash, or where you've got dueling press conferences where some allies are really leaning in on the Russia threat, and it contrasts with an American president that isn't commenting on it at all. I mean, I think Mark Rutte has very skillfully tried to reduce this, in essence, to a leaders' meeting. It's not really a proper summit. It's very short, a social dinner, and maybe one session the next day or one and a half. And so they will, as I understand it, not have a long communique that we usually negotiate for weeks leading up to the summit and is very contentious. They want this to be smooth. But I would hope that behind the scenes, that there are some frank and open and honest conversations, questions about where are we collectively going on Ukraine, with Europeans bringing forth more innovative ideas. It's not as if they haven't tried. We've had a whole array of European leaders arriving here in Washington since Trump walked into the Oval Office, trying to push, trying to present ideas, and they need to keep doing that. So it can't just be champagne toast, and great, we got to 5%, everything's fixed. They still have to get in under the hood, but without giving Putin the satisfaction of watching the summit collapse and having this be a train wreck. But where the rubber is really going to meet the road is determining where the alliance goes from here. My fear is that some Europeans will conclude, look, we got to the 5%, that's great, that's a wrap, and now America is going to be all in on NATO, right? And we don't know that. We don't know if the United States is going to be all in on NATO, even with the commitment to 5%. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know whether or not those force posture changes are going to be just announced with no consultation, and how deep they're going to dig into U.S. force posture. We don't know the America's way forward on Ukraine. We don't know whether or not the situation in Iran, Israel is going to bleed into alliance matters, and this war in the Middle East is going to start affecting the security of the alliance more broadly. There are a lot of open-ended questions. So I would just urge everyone not to be too reassured and assume that if this is a smooth summit and you get through what is in essence, a half day and a dinner without major issue, just know that there's plenty of work ahead. And I think that Twitter exchange between our ambassador to NATO right now, Matt Whitaker, and the Deputy Secretary of State, that was quickly deleted but showed some differences of opinion. Clearly, whoever wrote that tweet, whether or not it was the deputy or someone who worked for him, felt like, as they described it, NATO is a solution looking for a problem. And Matt Whitaker has clearly a different approach, appears to me very committed to the alliance, very effective as ambassador, and doing a great job. And so, how do those two worldviews, how will they work together or work against each other to present America's policies on NATO for the next 3.5 years? We're only through the first half year. So enjoy the champagne toast, enjoy the huge historic moment. We should celebrate it, but know that things will probably get even more complicated come September.
Uh, just adding to this, I think we have to be honest with ourselves. The best case is that of an alliance that really is quite different from what it has been for the past 80 close to 75 years. We have an administration that is absolutely crystal clear on the fact that it will remove troops from Europe, that it intends to see the Europeans taking a much larger share of European security. Some of these points, by the way, are bipartisan and are non-controversial from my perspective, and I think the European allies need to understand that. And, and avoid a situation where they believe, okay, we're going to muddle through the next 3.5 years and then we're going to go back to business as usual. So I think it's important to do this, but I think it's very different if we have a sort of organized, deliberate transformation of the alliance that is making sure that any US withdrawal is met by an effort but for the Europeans to mitigate the consequences of that, that there is clarity about depth of the US commitment to European security, even if it is from more further abroad and slightly more over the horizon than having tons of boots on the ground in Central Europe. I mean, all these things matter enormously, and I think the debate is in fact in a way just starting, and it is indeed a little disconcerting as a European to see a situation where we get slightly mixed messages. I mean, there are those who say, you know, we want a big surge in defense spending. We want much better burden sharing. We want a more larger European commitment. But don't worry, we are there not only with the extended nuclear deterrence, but also there will be substantial combat forces remaining in Europe, and there will be a very clear political commitment to the alliance. And those who are much more of the view that, in fact, there are other priorities, and the Europeans should take care of Europe, and the US will be at best over the horizon and possibly really drifting in a different direction. And I think this is a big question mark. All the European allies are working to achieve the first scenario. But I think there are debates in the administration on between the first and the second as we speak. And the biggest immediate concern or test case will be that force posture. Will the new SACEUR have the authority to preserve a very substantial and robust American presence in Europe that will complement a much more robust European commitment to the alliance, that will indeed provide more of the cavalry if there is a crisis somewhere, and that the Europeans will stop to rely too much on the US providing the first respondent to a crisis? That is okay. But the issue is, are we absolutely sure? And there, over this, there is the overarching political debate. And there, indeed, even the press conference at the end of the summit will matter, because if the message is thumbs up, things are okay, we're moving, it's quite different than a message that would say, a bit like what we had at the G7 summit, of saying, oh, I'm unhappy because my friend Vladimir was not invited, and it was a mistake to kick him out of the G8. There I think there is a risk of having something even on the eve of the summit that would carry a poor message, that would undermine the otherwise fairly good message of an alliance that is unified, that is moving towards achieving much more ambitious capability targets, that is much more capable of defending itself, and that has a better burden sharing. All these things are very positive, and I wouldn't want to see those undermined by a bit random comments in the immediate aftermath of the summit, even during the press conference. So I think that's going to be the big challenge, to keep a unified message coming out of the meeting room, hopefully with no drama in the meeting room, but also no bizarre spin outside the meeting room to portray this as a clash over issues. And that can come primarily from the US side, but it could also come from our allies that are concerned with the way Zelensky was treated and things like that, and that sort of create a situation where there is a mini crisis unfolding that then would mean that the whole positive message would be undermined.
Well, yeah, no, I agree with both of what you all said. There are a lot of spoilers, if you will, or unspoken issues, problems that hopefully will be. Well, we'll see if there's any frank discussions around the table. Maybe it's hallway chatter only. Maybe it's the talking to your seatmate there at the dinner or something along those lines, and it doesn't get into a plenary. But everything that you've laid out, I think, are absolutely things to make you depressed. So I agree with that. But let me take you into another direction. In terms of the remarkable, and I'm very much supportive of this the idea of Europe really coming together and realizing that it's time to kind of break this dependency on the United States, whether it's military, but it's also kind of breathing life into strategic autonomy. Trying to take it away from a word we used to fight over into something that really will show a counterbalance that Europe is able to do. based on where the U.S. seems to be going, whether it's Trump or post-Trump. I mean, a lot of what was discussed after the spectacle of Zelensky in the Oval Office and the approach by the Trump administration really seemed to me to bring a momentum to Europe, trying to at least parts of Europe trying to get together and move forward in a more in a stronger way as Europe. And so, how is that? How is that going? Has that stalled out? Is there still a lot of work being done to pull Europe together as an actor to counterbalance the U.S.? Will we see this at all at NATO? Are we going to maybe in some of the press conferences afterwards? But where are we? You know, Keir Starmer, getting closer to the EU, particularly on the defense side. There's a lot of things driving Europe together. And is that continuing, or has that stalled out, or has that been reduced to just a handful of countries in Europe? Where are we on that, and where will we see it at NATO? Camille.
I think I think we are on a good trajectory. First of all, there is this EU-UK security pact, which is sort of lifting the idea that there is an EU project that is separate from the wider European security, and there is this effort to bring the UK closer to the EU, and with both sides taking steps in that direction. So that is quite significant, and that is really important because it sort of uh, shows a united Europe. And of course, Norway's on board and all of that. There is a little more of a Turkish debate, but I think everyone is really trying to pull their act together and moving in the same direction.
Canada's
So,
on
so
board. I think Canada wants to join that
Canada will
too.
join the EU, as you know, but there is no, there is the Canadians share a lot of the values and approach on that, so there might be opportunities even to deepen the conversation with the Canadians. But altogether, so there is a very clear move there. Second, we see the EU putting its act together with a new team with Kaja Kallas, Andrius Kubilius, and Costa and von der Leyen, who's the only not new member of that team, that are sending the same message, which is essentially to say, okay, we're going to do a big effort to help achieve the NATO capability targets. They recognize, they've stopped the competition thing. They are saying, let's pull our act together and let's push hard on this, which could be very important, especially when it comes to mitigating the consequences of a US with partial withdrawal, especially of strategic enablers, where the EU can help build that at pace and faster. So that's going to be important, and we already see the EU putting together instruments to have, such as something which is called SAFE, which is enabling the Europeans to borrow at a very good rate over the 45 years to be able to meet their defense spending commitment faster. So all these things are really good. I can see more coming and there is also a European Council that same week. So that's we will hear more of that. Finally, I think the Europeans are also making an effort to develop their own Ukrainian strategy, which is not only about having a seat at the table, but saying, okay, we're going to develop the partnership with the Ukrainians. We are stepping up our assistance to Ukraine. We are doing essentially our job better. This is interesting because this is not built as an anti-NATO agenda, and this is why I'm hesitant to use the theme of strategic autonomy from that perspective, because it is really about Europeans, NATO, non-NATO stepping up. We'll see where it lands. I think what strikes me is, with maybe one outlier, which would be Viktor Orban, all of the Europeans are very much on the same page, and I think this is something that is very meaningful. And so I'm quite confident that we will see more Europe, and a Europe that is willing to take a bigger share of its own security. with that, and that's going to be interesting from a US perspective, not only for this administration, but that at a certain moment there will also be a sort of let go moment of saying, okay, you're doing more, and we recognize that, and that means that maybe the US role in the alliance will not be the traditional role that prevailed during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War.
This has been great. I guess in 30 seconds, there's some things we didn't talk about. Julie, you put IP4 on the table at the beginning, which I was hoping we would circle back to, but language on China, technology, defense industry, any one other or two other things that you want to just flag as things that you're looking for that we didn't cover?
Yeah, I mean, I will be disappointed if there's nothing on China in the one-page statement that they're going to churn out. I suspect they won't talk about it, but the transatlantic allies have done such good work together. This started in Trump's first term, carried on through the Biden administration, and could be a great project for allies going forward, talking about what China's doing in the Euro-Atlantic area. And also defense production. So much more work is needed there. And we do have to work to preserve at least some elements of the transatlantic defense industrial base. And I would hope that that will be a focus for what comes out of the summit.
I would, on the Indo-Pacific and China, I think it's an interesting thing because in a way, this administration is essentially telling the Europeans, take care of Europe. We're not that interested in your views about the Indo-Pacific or your role in the Indo-Pacific, which is a big change from the Biden administration, but also from Trump 1, which was signaling that it was super important for Washington. The one thing I would add, because that's really hot news, is the development in Iran. We don't know how they're going to impact the summit. It could be another very divisive issue, or it could be something where there is a need for transatlantic unity because the events as they unfold are critical. And here again, we do see an administration that is moving. It's developing its own plans a bit on its own, not necessarily looping in the allies. And I'm not suggesting that the allies should be part of anything, but they should certainly be part of a conversation to understand what's the end game that everyone is trying to achieve to preserve some sort of a unity over the very big issue there. And that is something that could be a sort of last minute spoiler into the summit if there is a lack of shared understanding of what is it that we're trying to achieve with the events in the Middle East collectively, and do we have a sort of unified approach to that, which is honestly currently not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, definitely. I mean, lots of potential landmines. But thank you for this discussion. I know we'll all be rooting for a successful summit and watching very closely what happens next week. But thanks for breaking it down and giving us this preview. It was really great.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great to see you both. And I wish we were still at NATO headquarters. We still have a lot of work to do, but we'll do our best from the outside.
Of course, the old guard would have done much better, but let's recognize that it's another team's turn, and I think the Secretary General Rutte has done a good job at pulling this together.
Yeah.
And at creating the conditions for a good summit. Now the issue is how will it go in the real world, because there are lots of unknown unknowns, but also some known unknowns, to use the Rumsfeldian terms.
And some known knowns.
Wonderful. Until next time.
Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.